Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, Conversation About Justice, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your public radio station. And today I will be speaking, and I'm Paul Gibson, by the way. I'm the host of Retake Our Democracy. And today we will be speaking with Viki Harrison, the former director of Common Cause New Mexico, who a bit ago was promoted and works now at a national level. And so we'll have a different perspective on things. We've had Viki on the show before, always a great guest, doesn't mince words, and is always very candid and insightful. So we're looking forward to her hit on what went on in the Roundhouse this session. But before we get to Viki, I want to just make a couple of brief announcements. Last week, we did a rerun from last April because Roxanne and I were running on fumes by the end of the Roundhouse session and couldn't get a show done. And so we posted a really interesting interview. It was actually the first one we've done with the Zoom technology. It was with Philip Shepard, who's developed a meditative practice focused on restoring our connection with our feelings and not letting our thinking drive our relationship to the world. And it was a fascinating interview. It went on for an hour and a half. And I hope if you didn't catch it the first time, you should check it out, and it's on our website. And if you're driving around today and you don't catch all of today's show, you can watch today's show on Saturday morning. It'll be posted just after it airs on KSFR. And you can also catch any of the other conversations we've had. They're all recorded and on the website under the Actions and Events menu. Before we get to Viki, I want to acknowledge that we're conducting this interview on stolen Tewa land and to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of that land. May we do as well, and we don't. I also want to let folks know that Retake is hosting one of our Zoominars on April 7th at 6 p.m., a conversation with none other than the premier pundit on New Mexico state politics, Joe Monahan. And so you can sign up for that Zoominar on our website under the Actions and Events menu. So let's get started with Viki. Hi, Viki. How are you?
Hey, Paul. How's it going?
Good. So even though you've been on the show before, and we just spent like 20 minutes talking before we started the show, I still always like to let our guests introduce themselves. So tell us a bit about yourself and how your role has changed since being promoted to the national team at Common Cause.
Absolutely. So for the folks who don't know me, my name is Viki Harrison, and I'm currently Director of State Operations at Common Cause. And as Paul said, was formerly the director here in New Mexico. And Common Cause, we like to call ourselves the People's Lobby. We work on democracy, voting issues, media access, a lot of really good things that we need for our government. And the story goes that our founder back in 1970, John Gardner, looked around DC and said, everybody's got a lobbyist but the people. Where's the people's lobbyist? And so we work on public financing and same-day registration and all kinds of good things.
Okay. And how have you found working at the national level? Are you working? I guess when we were talking earlier, you said you work with quite a number of legislatures.
I do. After being an advocate lobbyist in New Mexico for more than 2 decades, I'm now working with about a dozen different states, and there are so many similarities. There's always differences in rules and the unspoken rules and how things go. And it's, really been a lot more challenging this year, obviously, Paul, with the Rona. And the Rona has made things very different for state legislatures. We've got, some that are requiring people to come in to the Roundhouse in their state in order to testify, some that are allowing certain people to come in, some that are doing it all remote. And I think it's been a challenge because it's, it's hard not to be right there talking to legislators face to face. And
Mhm.
legislators around the country are getting so many phone calls and texts that it's hard to get your opinion out there. And I think this is going to show us some things that we're going to be able to do better as far as allowing remote testimony, which has been great for many of our rural states, but at the same time, making sure that everybody has the same kind of access.
Yeah, yeah,
It's been very different.
it is different. And, like there's nothing that can replace a 5-minute conversation in the hall face to face with a legislature. And so the best, most intimate conversations I've had are texting. And that does seem to get people's attention, but not every, I don't have every legislator's cell phone number. And
Right.
and I'm working my way up, but not everybody else has that kind of access either, and
Right.
so it's a delicate balance. I think that there's a lot to be gained from this Zoom technology and how it has brought the rural community into the hearing rooms, and it's allowed citizen advocates. To where they don't have to sit for 5 hours in a hearing room and wait for the floor hearing to end and the other hearing to begin at the 1:30 hearing to start at 5. And
Exactly.
so there's a good deal of positives, but there's also those negatives that you pointed out. So what was your general reaction to the session this year?
Um, I thought it, first of all, my biggest reaction was I thought it went a lot better than I predicted it would go. Just because of the pandemic. I was really concerned about what it was going to look like, how advocates were going to be able to weigh in. Like you said, those 5-minute face-to-face conversations are where, you kill bad amendments and get a good amendment through. And so there's, with the way our sessions are, and it's, our long session with a whopping 60 days, and, you're hanging out doing nothing for the first half, and then you're losing your mind the second half. I was really impressed with even bills, whether I supported them or not, whether they were common cause or not. I thought it was a rather productive session.
Yeah, we were talking before we got on the air about how that can be the case, and yet the thing that's sticking in your craw are the ones that didn't get through. So
The ones
tell us
that
a bit.
almost made it.
Yep. So tell us a bit about some of Common Cause's wins and priorities for the session, and then we'll get to some of the disappointments.
Well, our biggest win is public financing for district court races. Paul, this has been a dream of mine since 2012, and really in 2013, when Governor Susana Martinez vetoed a public financing bill that we had gotten through amazing results in 2013. And we got it through both chambers with just a few people voting against it. And it would have fixed our public financing system after a court ruling the year before that had struck down the matching funds. And so we were the first state in the country to address it. We got it through both chambers, and the governor vetoed it. And so Martinez said in her veto message, "This isn't enough. I want ground up judicial reform." And so that's when Common Cause New Mexico was like, all right, we want ground up judicial reform too, as a matter of fact. We can agree on something. Not right now, because you just vetoed my bill, but and so this has been something we've been working on. We have worked with making sure, because we have a great system for Supreme Court and Court of Appeals that allows them to use public financing.
Right.
And what we found, Paul, is even people who don't really like public financing understand how important it is for a judicial race. We have rules and regulations that are pretty good around judicial candidates, but there's always these little sketchy ways to get around them. Like you can't, be raising money for them, and you can't have a fundraiser. So I'll just call it a meet and greet. And suddenly it's not a fundraiser. And the rules say that judges can't know who's contributing to them, but they still know who's at the fundraiser. So they may not know the check. So getting Senate Bill, I believe it was 160, Senator Peter Worth and Katie Duhigg, who's my new state senator, really exciting. That was, I think, the number one. And number two was the redistricting reform. Another issue Common Cause New Mexico has been working on for decades is to get redistricting reform through. And of course, it's not everything we want. Nothing ever is in democracy. It's ugly, it's messy. Everybody thinks they're an expert in democracy. And so everybody's got an opinion. But a really good piece of legislation came through with the redistricting bill. And then the final big one, I think, for Common Cause New Mexico was a bill around Native American polling locations. It was House Bill 231, and which would require the tribes to have input and agreement before we can consolidate or close any polling locations on tribal lands, which is, after we found from last year, super huge. So those were three big ones that Common Cause got through.
Yeah, I have a hunch that the redistricting one, that Speaker Eagle really regrets his comments on our Zoominar, because I think that put him in a position to almost have to support this legislation, because it didn't sound good at all. It didn't play well.
Well, or I mean, I'm an eternal optimist. I like to think that that gave him some new information to think about. Okay. And it caused him to join as a sponsor and help get it through. So, you know, I mean, we definitely had some bad losses too, you know. I mean, we wanted to make sure that, you know, our Post-Conviction Rights Restoration Act did not get through, failed in concurrence. We had another bill that we supported by Senator Peter Worth on segregated bank accounts to clean up more around our disclosure bill that took a decade to pass and finally passed a couple of years ago. But as we know, Paul, people are always going to try to find sketchy ways to get through things. Okay, people are sketchy. And we cannot always create laws to catch every single thing. But that's why with campaign finance and voting, you constantly improve.
Right. So we've heard a bit about some of the bills that didn't go as well as you would have liked, that were Common Cause bills. What were some of your big surprises, and, you know, like, yes, other bills outside of Common Cause that got through that maybe surprised you, or were a long time coming, and thank God?
Oh my gosh. Going to the voters, the permanent fund for education. I can't even tell you, I cried, I laughed. I've had so many friends and advocates working on that for so long. And I can literally remember when they first started working on it and people were poo-pooing, there's no way we're going to take money out of the land grant. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm reading this, the land grant fund, it's not the land grant fund, it's the education fund. It's supposed to be for education. And the years of, this is for rainy days while we're out here drowning. And right. I mean, having that one go through, I think is paid sick leave. Another one that, you know, people have fought so hard for so long. Another one, the end of life options. I was just, you know, I mean, Paul, as somebody who's getting a little bit older, I like to keep my options available. And I was really thrilled to see that. It was, of course.
Did you see any of the hearings and the testimony by Debbie Armstrong and her daughter?
Unbelievable. So compassionate and brilliant, and just knew the issue so well. And it was just, I mean, and that's the best part of our legislators in New Mexico, for me, Paul, is that we've got so many that I've worked with over the years, whether I agreed with them or not, they're there because they really care about it. I used to get ribbed by the media all the time because I would say the vast majority of them are awesome people. They are not pulling a fast one just because you think all politicians are bad. And I firmly believe that. And, you know, listening to Representative Armstrong on that bill showed us the best of what somebody can be.
Yeah. That was I mean, it's hard to call that a highlight because it was so poignant and painful to watch, but it was some of the most compelling testimony I've ever seen
It
in any
was,
context.
and then of course we had some heartbreaking losses, that got really close. The cannabis legislation. I mean, I appreciate that the governor's going to call a special session, but that's not necessary. It shouldn't have been necessary. They've known about these issues forever. Get together and work on them. Take all
Yeah,
the poison pills out. And of course, there needs to be restoration and expungement and all of this. We can't pass marijuana, make it legal, and have a bunch of white folks make a bunch of money off of it while our Black and brown friends and neighbors and family are sitting in jail for the same thing. And we've seen it in other places. And we have an opportunity to do it right. We don't need state-owned stores. We don't need to worry about if people have got 3 plants or 5 plants or 10 plants. I mean, as somebody who gardens with tomatoes, I'm happy if half of them actually live. They might need 10 or 20 plants. It's just stupid. And we see, I mean, Arizona passes it and they're going to be up and running in a few months after passing it. I mean, we saw California pass it and then drag their feet for a couple of years. We are dying on the vine in New Mexico. We need resources. This is something, and as somebody who used to be a bartender for many years, Paul, I would much rather deal with stoned people than drunk people any day of the week.
I'm with you on that one.
And of course, another heartbreaking loss for me from the sidelines was the payday loan bill. The payday loan bill was, I can remember when I first heard about that bill years ago, and the compromise was 175%. And my mind just blew. I was like, what are you even talking about? That didn't even make sense. And I thought the 36% that people were advocating for was ridiculous. I was like, it should be 5%. I mean, come on, and so we've heard those same arguments from the industry since this bill was introduced. There's always some person who has terrible credit that needs a couple of $100, or they're going to lose their house or starve to death. And we saw in the hearings where the sponsors, the credit unions, they refuted that over and over. And it was just really heartbreaking to see, because a 99% is not a compromise. That does not help the people who need it. And we're talking about a state where more than a quarter of our population is living in poverty.
Right.
It was a heartbreaking loss. And I know it got a lot closer than it has before. I know it can get there again. And I feel very certain that that's one of the bills that we will see pass in the next year.
Okay, well, I hope so. Without, I would say that and the public bank being just dismissed out of hand were the two big disappointments for me.
That was a huge disappointment for me. We had a Common Cause board member for many years, Craig Barnes, who used to have a radio show on Saturday mornings right here. And I did that many times. And that was a dream of his. And he worked on that with the advocates. And that was something I was really surprised to not, that one, they didn't even really get a fair hearing or hearings.
No, they didn't. And it's one of the things that we noted is that, we've done a lot on the election end of things and have changed the chemistry in both chambers now. And, but there's still this really arch conservative factor in the production of the FIRs and the analysis of bills and things like that. And so there were some really some FIRs that were, it was a little bit like hearing the Representative Alcon introducing this crazy amendment. Your head's exploding because it doesn't make any sense. And some of the FIRs were the same. I mean, with the public bank, the thing that set Lundstrom off was that it said in the bill that there would be $100 million appropriation. And that just wasn't true. I mean, there was nothing in the bill that said anything about an appropriation. And it's hard to imagine that was a mistake. And yet, you know, but once it's in an FIR, it's very hard to get it out of legislators' heads.
Well, it is, and you can fight back and get an amended FIR, but they're still going to come back to that.
Right.
And you know, FIRs used to be like actual facts. And I can remember years ago when opinions started creeping into them, and I was so shocked because kind of a purist sometimes. And I'm like, wait a minute, this opinion that you don't like the bill should not be in here. This is an FIR.
Right. Yeah, well, we'll talk maybe a bit more about that in a little bit, but I need to remind our listeners that they're listening to KSFR 101.1 FM, your public radio station. And during this time of being kind of sequestered at home, quarantined at home, the radio station is all the more important to all of us as it brings us local news, local music, cultural information, and just a lot of good political discussions from shows like this and others. So I want to remind you that if you've got a little chunk of change available, maybe you got a relief check recently, you might want to share a little of your relief with KSFR. Just go to ksfr.org, go to the click on the donate button, and send them $20 and just view it as your ticket to admission to some really good programming. So with that, we'll get back to Viki Harrison, who's the state policy director. Is that what it is?
Director of State Operations.
Okay. For Common Cause, and the former executive director of Common Cause New Mexico. And we've been talking about the 2021 legislative session, logically enough. Some folks say that even in a 60-day session, which is the long session, there just isn't enough time to address all the issues facing the legislature. What is your view on that? And is it time, or is there something else in play?
Oh, it's beyond time. This is something Common Cause has been supporting here in New Mexico for years, not only lengthening the sessions, but also paying our legislators so we actually can get a better representative government, because we only give them per diem when they're in session. So we end up with more people who are retired or who own their own businesses or who can afford to take a couple of months off. And if we could pay everybody, then we could get the 29-year-old grocery clerk and the school teacher, and we could get a better, and I think hand in hand, that would work. And I think that there's lots of ways that, you know, I always say that our session was created and designed from 100 years ago to keep the people out. I mean, it's in Santa Fe in the winter, for heaven's sakes. I mean, you can't even park. They built a parking garage and immediately gave it to staff. So you're still fighting for that top level when you're in session. And, you know, it takes you 10 hours to get there from some places. Not this year. But I just think that it's time to look at that and to look at lengthening our sessions, but not doing what other states do, which you and I talked about earlier, is they can sometimes have a 4 or 6 month session, but still only meet 60 days within that session and take a bunch of breaks in between, which I think would be really difficult to do in such a large state as ours, because do our legislators want to be driving back and forth every couple of days from home? I think not. So I think that we've done polling on this at Common Cause the last few years, and paying legislators, lengthening the sessions, those numbers of support are going up and up every single year.
What are they now?
They're over 50%, which is that happened last year for the first time.
Okay, yeah. Because I had, in talking with Speaker Egolf, he said, you know, we could get it through the legislature, but it won't get past the voters. And so I guess
that's something that you see a lot of, because, you know, people love to hate politicians. So they go and they're just going to vote it down if you don't have that education campaign. Right.
Well, one of the things that Retake has been advocating for lately is to limit the number of bills that a legislator can introduce. to maybe 5 or 6 or 7. Our thinking on that is there be a few less green chili memorials introduced that can take an hour to, and an hour is a big deal in the last week. And then just other bills, you look at all the bills that are, on the House floor and the Senate floor the last day, and, mixed in with some very important bills mixed in there, and then some other bills where you're kind of going like, really? And so if we were a bit more discreet in what we introduced, might that help?
Some places absolutely do that. I was talking a few years ago to a group of legislators from about 6 different African countries, and they were shocked when they heard how things went. And like, what do you mean you just quit at noon and leave? What do you mean? And you don't debate every bill? And they're like, we each have like maybe 2 or 3 bills, and that's it. And we have to all discuss them and have that conversation. And I think it is something that, we heard this year that the Democrats in the House were going to limit or ask their members to only do 5 bills each. I think it's something that is absolutely worth having a conversation about. I mean, I realize there's always, things that come up at the end, which is why people like to keep the dummy bills around.
Right.
And always a way to, if something happens mid-session. But I think that I don't know that that will always take care of the problems, because we've had for years, I mean, we've had bills to get rid of memorials. We've had bills for years to not do all of the pomp and circumstance that people often like.
I'm not a big fan of the pomp and circumstance, but I also, whether it's the basketball game that the Senate plays against the House, I mean, when you're working the grueling hours that they are, I think they do deserve, a little bit of a break. And one of the things that I've gotten much more sensitized to doing is rather than like being all outraged at the end of the session and like, how come you couldn't get blah, blah, blah done, is a lot more appreciation of just how hard these folks work and and under what difficult circumstances. I mean, it's just not easy. It's just not easy. So
No, not at all.
So our biggest disappointment, and you alluded to it, was the SB 66, the bill that would have capped the loans at 36%. You said you've had a history with this, and you maybe have seen bills like this in other legislatures. But what was your reaction? I know you watched the House Judiciary Committee, as did I. What was your reaction to that? Well, how did that happen?
I said, as we talked about earlier, this is that argument that somebody needs this and they're not going to have anybody. They bring that up every single time. And it's been I don't know that I've ever, Paul, heard another argument for it other than that one single one. And
So
the only history.
Viki, we're going to have to talk about that on the podcast.
Awesome.
I just realized I was so interested, I didn't pay any attention to the time. You've got about 20, 30 seconds to tell our listeners where they can get more information about you and Common Cause.
They can go to commoncause.org and read all about it and join us in our fight for democracy.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Viki, and just stick around and we'll pause for a minute so that the radio engineer knows we're done. And then we'll continue the conversation for the podcast. And by the miracle of podcast, we're back. Because of this format, I always forget to actually close the show from me. I give you a chance to say goodbye. Right. And then I just don't even think about it because I'm going to be right back. But I need to do that, if you want more information about Retake Our Democracy, go to blah,
yes.
blah, blah, blah. Oh, well. So we were talking about SB 66 and what was your view of what transpired in House Judiciary?
It's just this, as I was saying, Paul, it's the same thing I've seen transpire in any state or in any committee. It's the one argument that the industry has that, again, when you're a citizen legislature who's meeting in such a short time frame, they don't have a lot of staff. I mean, they have a secretary. Sometimes they're sharing a secretary. The committees have analysts, but a lot of times those are, brand new right out of college, and there's not a lot of other history. And the people who own the history are the lobbyists. Now, they can be good lobbyists like me or bad lobbyists. And I think that that has been the only argument, and it comes up over and over, and people are genuinely concerned about that, and they may not have enough information about it, and they're being hit with so many different things. And as we saw this year, just because you've looked at a bill, 100-page bill, and you're ready to vote on it, well, you can get to committee and there's a brand new committee sub introduced. So you're just being inundated by information. And when you can dangle something like that out there, it causes enough confusion that even people who want to vote for a 36% cap are like, wait a minute, what are the unintended consequences?
It just feels to me that whether you're talking about the banking industry, the gas and oil industry, the insurance industry, it doesn't matter. They like to plant that uncertainty, and they like the environment that breeds it. And, I've seen Ivy Soto is notorious for this, where he takes a lot of his amendments make sense. I mean, he's tightening things up or what have you, but how in the world do you track that on the fly? You thought you were prepared for the hearing and the bill that you were going to hear. And suddenly he starts going, and in paragraph 6, line here, we're going to strike this word here. And then in the next paragraph, you're going like, really? How do you?
Well, and that's one of the better ones, because the other option is people going, you know what I mean? We'll draft an amendment after committee and have it ready for the next one. And the audience is going, yeah, but how does that help me track it within the bill?
Right, exactly. There's a lot of fine tuning that needs to be done in the legislative process. And to me, the SB 66 really signified the power of the lobbyist. Can you talk a little bit about ways that we might be able to contain, reduce, eliminate, we're not going to eliminate, but at least significantly reduce their influence?
Well, that's the time old question. We did a report years ago around lobbying, and New Mexico Ethics Watch just updated it around lobbying in New Mexico last year, maybe the year before now. And, because in New Mexico, Paul, as you know, a lot of the lobbyists used to be legislators. They're the legislators' brothers and wives and husbands and daughters and people that they've known each other forever. And I'll never forget when we did that report back in 2013, former state senator Rod Adair said, oh gosh, Viki, you're just so smart. You figured out that industry supports legislators who like their causes. And he was such a little smart aleck about it, of course. And I said, we're not saying that you're buying votes. And I really don't believe that. I don't believe that they're buying votes. But what they do by making contributions or doing expenditures, paying for dinners or whatever, is they're now getting access.
Right.
It's not about the money, it's about the access. And if you're a legislator who gets 100 phone calls in a day, you're only human. And it's not even that it's bad, but if 10 of them are people versus 90 people you don't know, and you can't possibly get through the whole list, I don't think it's, I think that's the biggest way I have found to curb that influence is public financing. If you don't ever need an industry or a lobbyist to cut that campaign check, then you've got a lot more freedom.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a lot more freedom. We hear about it all the time. I mean, Congress, they are supposed to dial for dollars 4 hours a day.
Right,
I
right.
mean, I'll never forget our governor when she first got elected to Congress, her first term. And I happened to run into her the day after the election. I've known her many years, many different offices. And she was so upset because she said, I just won yesterday. I haven't even taken office. And everybody's telling me I need to raise $1 million before the year ends, before I even take office for the next campaign. And that's what it's like. It's a constant scramble. And, here in New Mexico, I mean, we can blame a lot on Citizens United. It did open the floodgates.
Right.
And House races and Senate races used to be very, very cheap in New Mexico, and they're not anymore. And I think public financing, and I think one thing that we saw a lot better of this year with the combo of people being able to Zoom in is legislators hearing from people besides lobbyists, legislators hearing from their constituents. I mean, I can remember many, many years ago when Jeff Bingaman was representing New Mexico. This was many years ago, and back before email, when you still wrote letters. And I said, why would I write you a letter? I mean, you're in Congress. Why would I write you a letter? You're not going to listen to me. And he said, I absolutely do, because for every letter I get, I multiply that by 10,000. Because I think that if one person's thinking it, at least 10,000 are thinking it and are not picking up a pencil. And so the power of the people.
What's a pencil?
Yeah. What's cursive? And I think that really is something I saw make a difference, because we saw things like we just talked about on the show of the good stuff that did pass this year that had been long and hard fought wins.
Well, we've talked a little bit about the need for a paid legislature. Do you want to add anything to that? I mean, I sort of feel like you had talked about how it's going to get us the 29-year-old store clerk, right? The legislature would look more like the state instead of like something not at all like the state.
Not at all like the state. And I think that, and again, we're not even, I think the last poll that we asked would be like, it was like a median income for New Mexico. So we weren't asking, can we pay them $100,000 a year? I mean, it was way less than that. But, since they're volunteers, once they leave the session, they don't have staff. They're the ones who are answering their emails and phones. They don't have staff. And again, during session, they may have a really awesome secretary. It may be somebody like Lee Witt, who is brilliant and knows everything. Or it could be my neighbor's cousin's brother's dog sitter that I happen to bring up with me. And so they don't have, I just feel like if we had more, if we paid them, if the sessions were longer and we gave them staff, then we could get more production.
Yeah. Well,
and both sides of the aisle have asked for this in the past. I mean, we've had Republicans and Democrats that have pushed for paid legislatures. And, it can be difficult because Albuquerque has tried to do that for the counselors, and it's failed times. I think it passed one time finally. But once you spend 5 seconds really talking to people why it's not just paying the same old people, they get it. The public is a lot smarter than a lot of people think they are. They get these details, and it's not too wonky for them. And you can explain what we just talked about, and they'll vote for it.
Yeah, I mean, Brittany Barrera is an example in the House. Now, people with lived experience, it may take them a session or two to pick up on all the nuances of how the legislative process works and the large jargon and whatnot. And they may forget to say, gentle lady, blah, 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 once or twice, but they bring this lived experience that is so important, that they
and
have.
It's just, it's so refreshing.
Yes.
So refreshing. And again, you think, and I always hope that, the new legislators will reach out to some of us old school lobbyists for some of the tips and tricks of the trade.
They should do that. Well, thank you, Viki, for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And
It
I'm
was
sure
so
that,
good to talk to you, Paul. And just,
Yeah.
you know, it's so great. Common Cause loves our partnership with Retake and all the great work that y'all do. You're super strategic and you take on those tough issues, and we appreciate it.
Okay, well, thank you. You do the same, and take care of yourself. We both got our second shots in the last few days. We'll be out at restaurants sometime soon. All right, take
That's
care.
right.
All right,
Thanks, Paul.
bye-bye.